On a summer night in June 1967, a 75-year-old widow named Louisa Dunne was alone in her small terraced home in Bristol, England. A neighbor heard a muffled scream, then a few seconds of crying out, then silence. 2 days later, Louisa was found dead on her own living room floor. One elderly woman, one quiet street, 58 years of nothing. For more than half a century, this was the case that British police could not crack. They took palm prints from almost every man in the neighborhood. They chased it for decades. And still, the man who did it slipped through, moved away, started a new life, and grew old believing he had gotten away with it forever. He was wrong, because in 2025, a scrap of clothing kept in storage for 58 years finally gave up his name. And what police uncovered when they found him would turn out to be far darker than a single murder. This is the oldest cold case ever solved in British history, and this is how it was finally cracked. Welcome to Crime Watch UK, where no case stays cold forever. Let's go back to the beginning. Easton, Bristol, June 1967. A working-class neighborhood of narrow terraced houses, where neighbors knew each other, and front doors were sometimes left on the latch. On Britannia Road lived a woman named Louisa Dunne. She was 75 years old. Louisa had lived a full, and in many ways, a sad life. She'd been widowed not once, but twice. Her first husband, Edwin, had been a city councillor, a man she'd shared lively political discussions with, a man people thought might one day make her the city's mayoress. He died in the 1940s. Her second husband, a night watchman named John Dunne, died in the early 1960s. By 1967, both of her husbands were gone. She had become, by many accounts, something of a recluse. Her world had shrunk down to the few streets around her home. Neighbors remembered her as a kindly woman who, in their words, wouldn't hurt a fly. She was small, frail, less than 7 stone, just over 5 feet tall, and she was alone. Sometime between the 26th and the 28th of June, 1967, a man came to Louisa Dunne's home. We now know he forced his way in. That night, a neighbor heard something through the thin walls, a muffled scream, followed by crying out that lasted several seconds, then nothing. On the 28th of June, a neighbor discovered Louisa's body on the floor of her living room. She had been raped, and she had been strangled to death. A frail 75-year-old widow, attacked in the one place she should have been safest, her own home. The community was horrified. This wasn't a crime in some dark alley. This was an elderly woman, murdered in her bedsit on an ordinary residential street, and the people of Easton wanted the man who did it caught. The police of 1967 threw everything they had at it. This was decades before DNA. There was no genetic database, no genealogy, no forensic science as we know it today. What they did have was fingerprints, or in this case, palm prints. The killer had left prints at the scene, so the police did something extraordinary. They launched a mass screening of the neighborhood. They took palm prints from almost every man in the area, trying to find a match. Thousands of prints, house by house, man by man, and not one of them matched. The killer's prints were on file from the crime scene, but the man they belonged to was never printed. He simply wasn't in the net. The trail went cold. For Louisa Dunne's family, the murder didn't just take a grandmother, it detonated something. Her granddaughter, Mary Dainton, was 20 years old and at art college when she learned what had happened. Not from a phone call, but from reading an obituary in a newspaper. She had only met her grandmother once, briefly, in a hospital, where Louisa had held her hand tightly and tried to make a connection, and yet the murder haunted her for the next 58 years. The family sort of fell to pieces after the murder, she would later say. Her own mother, Louisa's daughter, suffered a nervous breakdown, and carried the stigma of it for the rest of her life. Mary was raised, in her words, not to talk about things, not to ask questions. So she swallowed it. She went on as if nothing had happened. But decades later, she got out the old photographs of her grandmother and realized she knew nothing about her. And the not knowing became, in her own word, almost obsessive. She spent 58 years trying to come to terms with a murder she'd never even understood. The years passed. 1 decade became 2, 2 became 4. By any reasonable measure, this case was dead. The investigators who'd worked it were retiring, or already gone. The neighborhood changed. The world moved on. But there was one thing that never moved: the evidence. Back in 1967, investigators had collected items from the scene, including Louisa's clothing, and rather than discard it as the decades rolled by, it was carefully stored, kept, preserved. For 58 years, that clothing sat in storage, holding on to a secret that no science of its era could read. It was waiting for the technology to catch up, and eventually, it did. In 2023, the case was reviewed once again, and this time, investigators re-examined the old forensic evidence with modern tools. On Louisa's clothing, stored all those decades, they found something the men of 1967 could never have detected: DNA, a genetic profile of the man who had attacked her. Now they had the killer's DNA. But a profile is only useful if you can match it to a person. So they ran it, and it came back to a name: a 92-year-old man, living quietly hundreds of miles away in Ipswich. His name was Ryland Headley. Here is the detail that makes this case so chilling. When the murder happened in 1967, Ryland Headley wasn't some stranger passing through. He had been living in Bristol. He was around 35 years old at the time. And in the aftermath of the murder, when police were taking palm prints from nearly every man in the area, Headley moved. He relocated to a property just beyond the perimeter of the police search, just outside the net. He then resettled in Ipswich, hundreds of miles away. He worked as a railway machinist. He had married and had 3 children. He grew older and older and older, an ordinary-seeming old man, while the murder of Louisa Dunne gathered dust in a cold case file. He had hidden in plain sight for 58 years. In November 2024, at the age of 92, Ryland Headley was arrested.
I'm arresting you on suspicion of the rape and murder of Louisa Dunne.
But the DNA was only the beginning of the case against him. When detectives compared the palm prints recovered from Louisa's home back in 1967, the very prints that had never matched anyone in that mass screening, they matched Ryland Headley. So now there were 2 independent pieces of forensic evidence: DNA on her clothing and his palm prints at the scene. When the case came to trial at Bristol Crown Court in June 2025, prosecutors told the jury just how powerful that DNA match was. The genetic material, they said, was 1 billion times more likely to belong to Ryland Headley than to anyone else. 1 billion times. And then came the voices from the past. The jury was read witness statements originally taken in 1967, including from the neighbor who, all those years ago, had described hearing that muffled scream and the crying out in the night. A doctor who had pronounced Louisa Dunne dead back in 1967 came to court nearly 6 decades later to give evidence. The past and the present stood together in that courtroom. Headley pleaded not guilty. He denied everything. The jury did not believe him. On the 30th of June 2025, 58 years after Louisa Dunne was murdered in her own living room, Ryland Headley was found guilty of her rape and murder. He was 92 years old. Believed to be the oldest person ever convicted of murder in Britain. The next day, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 20 years. The judge looked at the 92-year-old man before him and said the words that closed 58 years of waiting: "You will never be released." You will spend the rest of your life in prison. For Louisa's granddaughter, Mary, it was the closure she'd stopped believing she would ever get. She said she was stunned when she learned Headley had even been charged. After a lifetime of swallowing the pain, she was finally, in her words, processing what I should have processed when I was 20. But the story does not end there. Because when police looked into the life of the man they had finally caught, they found that Louisa Dunne was almost certainly not his only victim. Ryland Headley had a history. In the 1970s, after he'd moved to Ipswich, he admitted to a string of burglaries, and in 1977 he was convicted of raping 2 elderly women and was originally sentenced to life in prison. That sentence was later reduced on appeal. He served only around 2 years, and then he walked free again. Think about that. A man who attacked elderly women, free for decades, while the murder of an elderly woman in Bristol sat unsolved the entire time. After his 2025 conviction, police in Suffolk and Norfolk began reviewing other unsolved murders and rapes from the 1970s and 80s, particularly cases involving elderly women, for any possible link to Ryland Headley. The case of Louisa Dunne may have cracked open something far larger than anyone imagined. Think about what this case really means. In 1967, the science to catch Ryland Headley simply did not exist. The police did everything they could. They printed nearly every man in the neighborhood, and he still slipped through because he was never in the system and because he moved just outside the search before they could reach him. For 58 years, he believed that was the end of it. He grew old. He had a family. He hid in plain sight as an ordinary elderly man. But there was one thing he couldn't control: a piece of clothing, kept in an evidence store, waiting half a century for science to catch up to it. That clothing outlasted his luck. It outlasted his lies. It even nearly outlasted his life. He was caught at 92, just in time to hear a jury say the word guilty. Louisa Dunne was a frail, kindly widow who wouldn't hurt a fly, murdered in the one place she should have been safe. For 58 years, no one answered for it. Now someone has. No case stays cold forever. If this story moved you, do one thing for a woman who waited 58 years for justice, and for the family who never stopped carrying her. Subscribe to Crime Watch UK and turn on notifications so you're there the moment the next impossible cold case finally gets its answer. Because evidence is patient, and no matter how many years pass, no matter how far a man runs, the truth has a way of waiting him out. We'll see you on the next one.